The reading is from Luke chapter 6, verses 43 to 49, and can be found on page 60 in the Pew Bibles. A tree and its fruit. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. Continuing on with the wise and foolish builders. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. We thank God for his word.
Well, I need to begin today's sermon with a confession. Last week, as you know, I was preaching on love and judgment, and I was reminding us of Jesus' clear command that we are not to judge. And yet, within half an hour from stepping away from the lectern down there, I had already violated this command. It happened during coffee time, when I found myself part of a conversation about a certain presidential candidate on the other side of the Atlantic, who, for the sake of this illustration, will remain nameless. But it's enough to say that this gentleman is quite triggering for me. And so, with my sermon on judgment not long from my lips, I found myself veering out of the discernment lane onto the motorway of condemnation. And with my foot firmly on the accelerator, I was driving quickly towards Judgment Town on my way to Self-Righteous City. Before that is, my conversation partners gently reminded me of the sermon and encouraged me to put the brakes on before I veered out of control. How easy it is for all of us to slip into that holier-than-thou mode. How easily we portray the poverty of love in our hearts. And you know, it doesn't matter if the object of our scorn is a public figure that we might find quite obnoxious at times. Our words should always be born out of love. Because to be a disciple, as we've been learning, is to be with Jesus, so that we might become like Jesus, so that we might learn to do the things that Jesus did. And having been with Jesus in Luke's gospel these past weeks, it's clear to us that being like Jesus means first and foremost being loving. And doing the things that Jesus did means first and foremost acting in love. And this means that this is what Jesus means, I think, by this analogy he gives us, this metaphor of the tree and its fruit. A good tree, he says, will bear good fruit. And he uses another metaphor too, of course. He tells us that we're to build our very house, our lives, on this foundation of love. And there's plenty we could say about that image too, but on this Harvest Sunday, it seems appropriate that we linger on this other image, this metaphor of a tree and its fruit. And so I want to take a few moments to explore this image with you. And I want to ask two questions, really. The first one is pretty simple. What is good fruit? Now, this might not be immediately obvious from the passage. Jesus leaves us open to our interpretation here. But if we look at the Apostle Paul elsewhere in the New Testament, he's much more explicit for us about what this good fruit looks like. Sandy's already talked about it with our children, because in Galatians 5 we find Paul's description of the fruit of the Spirit. And here he is riffing on Jesus' image in Luke 6 of the tree and its fruit. Esther knows them off by heart. I kind of need them written down here just to make sure I get them in the right order. But let me go through them with you. The fruit of the Spirit, writes Paul, is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, most of us know this list well. But I wonder, have you ever stopped to wonder why Paul says the fruit of the Spirit and not the fruits when we have this list of virtues here? Well, someone who's helped me to ponder this question is a preacher from the 19th and early 20th century, G. Campbell Morgan. He ministered at Westminster Chapel, in fact, I think during both World Wars, remarkably. Campbell suggests that the fruit of the Spirit is love. That's it. But he goes on to say that all these other virtues that Paul writes about here are manifestations of that love. So, joy then is love's consciousness. Peace is love's confidence. Patience is love's habit. Kindness is love's activity. Generosity is love's quantity. Isn't that beautiful? Faithfulness is love's quality. Or generosity is quantity. And gentleness is love's tone. And self-control is love's victory. I love this way of understanding the fruit of the Spirit, because it reminds us again that being like Jesus and doing like Jesus begins with love. And understanding love as the fruit helps us to avoid the mistake of thinking that these qualities Paul lists are qualifications needed to be disciples. In other words, it reminds us that we don't need to be patient or peaceful or generous before we can follow Jesus. No, when we begin with love, we realize that this good fruit is the product of our following Jesus. As we experience more of his love in our lives, we become more patient, we become more peaceful, we become more generous, we become more loving. So that's the answer to our first question. Good fruit is love. But now another question emerges. How do we grow this good fruit? Well, I don't know very much about fruit trees, but given that I'm from the Orchard County of Armagh, I thought it was about time I learned something. So this week, I've been doing a little research about apple trees. And I've discovered something really interesting. Well, you mightn't find it interesting at all, but I found this really interesting. I discovered that apple trees have an unusual genetic trait. Apparently, they don't grow true to the seed, okay? So this means that if you plant an apple seed, like Sandy was saying to the children, and you manage to make it grow, I don't think I could achieve that, but if you did, it will not grow into a tree that produces the same fruit as the fruit from which the seed came. It won't be the same as the parent tree. In fact, apparently the fruit can be drastically different from the original tree, and often it's inferior in quality. It seems, from what I read anyway, that for good quality apples to grow with consistency and reliability, like Armagh apples, which are the best in the world, they need to be grafted. They need to be joined to a root tree. And this got me thinking about this image Jesus gives us of a tree and its fruit. Because it's not just in Luke's gospel that he uses this image. We find a similar metaphor being used in John 15. You'll know these words well. There he talks about bearing fruit. And he says that to be his disciples, to bear fruit, that can only happen when we are joined to him. I am the vine, he says. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, there's both a positive and a negative here in this teaching. There's an encouragement for us, and there's also a warning. Let me say a word about the encouragement first. And to do this, I'm going to take you to my home county of Armagh for a moment, to one of our many heritage buildings. I feel like a tourist rep this morning for Armagh, but it is a beautiful county. And if you know it, this is Ardress House. And it's here that you will find some of the oldest apple trees in the county. In the McNeese orchards, just beside Ardress House, there are trees which were planted apparently as early as 1880, which makes them over 140 years old. It's incredible. Now, those trees, I think, are enjoyed more now for their apple blossom than for their fruit. But the fact is, from what I've researched anyway, when properly cared for, when nurtured, century-old apple trees can produce really high-quality fruit. And more than that, they often produce fruit of rich varieties that younger trees aren't able to grow. Seeing the trees, or thinking of these trees in this orchard, makes me think of the older saints in my life who've had a profound influence on me. Those older men and women who have borne fruit that have helped make God credible in my life. I think, for example, of a friend of ours we've mentioned before from the front, who in her mid-90s now continues to grow in faith and love in ways that amaze us, experiencing God in new and deeper ways in her twilight years. And of course, I'm thinking also of new friends we've made here. Friends who've continued to demonstrate the exciting truth that God always has more ways to teach us. That Christ always has new ways for us to bear fruit, whatever season of life we're in. So there's real encouragement here for us. For the well-established trees among us, be encouraged that you offer something that younger saplings like me and even younger saplings cannot offer. You offer us the fruits of lives of faithful discipleship. And for our still growing trees, be encouraged that when you remain in Christ, you will continue to bear fruit in all the seasons of your life too. And maybe on this point, I can just say a quick word to our young people in particular. Don't neglect this gift, the gift of this congregation. Don't miss out on the riches that come from making friends across generations. We sometimes in this church talk about it as time traveling with friends. Now, in a few weeks' time, pay attention, because you're going to be hearing about how we can actually do that, how we can go time traveling together. But I'll not say any more about that now. Right now, I want to just take you back to Jesus' words, because aside from encouragement, there's also a warning here. In John 15, Jesus goes on to say, God the Father cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. And on this point, we're going to linger just a little bit longer in those ancient orchards of Armagh, just one last time. Because the fact is that not all the apple trees in that garden or that orchard I told you about continue to bear fruit throughout their lives. Indeed, an apple tree, even a tree with a venerable heritage as the trees at Ardress House, it will revert back to its wild state when it's not properly cared for. I didn't know this about apple trees, but apparently it's true. When this happens, when they're not tended to, the apples become small and tart. They become bitter and inedible, not unlike the crab apples in the manse garden. Jesus warns us that something similar can happen to us. If our inner lives are not tended to, we can become bitter. If we're not spiritually nourished, we can grow small. I think we can all recognize this. I know I certainly do. There have been times when I felt just out of sorts in the world, times when I've been a bit ratty, even a bit cynical, times when I felt spiritually dry. But looking back on those times as I did this week, as I was preparing this sermon, I can see that often I felt this way not because God was silent, but because I had switched myself off from God. I had neglected to be silent before Him. And the only thing in those times that's enabled me to overcome this spiritual dryness and to be restored to myself is to be grafted again onto the vine. Often when Emma will say to me, "Have you prayed recently?" And I've been connected again to Jesus and been revived by this water of life. And if I reflect a bit more, those periods of dryness for me have often been because my attention has been diverted elsewhere. Often in my case, as you can probably guess, it's the busyness of work when I just haven't taken time to be still. That's why Jesus tells us that to continue bearing good fruit, we sometimes need to do a little pruning. Sometimes there are things we just need to cut out of our lives if we are to remain spiritually healthy. And last Sunday, I got a lovely example of this. Some of us were at Cook Centenary Church to listen to the group Made for More with our young people. And this is a Christian charity that helps Christian young people to think about their mental health. And during one of the sessions, I got speaking to a young man from another church, another congregation, not Cook and not here. And I was asking him about what he thought about this move now to ban smartphones for young people below 15, I think it is. Because we have a daughter approaching that stage. And I was keen to know what he thought. And I was really interested at his response. Because he said, having a mobile phone's good to phone a friend or to text, be part of a group chat. But he said he really regrets the influence of social media on his life. And recently, he's taken steps to sort of take time away from that because he recognized that it wasn't good for him emotionally and it wasn't good for him spiritually. I was really impressed by this young man. Here was someone who had the wisdom to know that he needed a little bit of pruning. My prayer today as we listen to these words of Jesus is that God might give us such wisdom too. As we aspire to produce good fruit in our lives, let us not commit the folly of thinking we don't need such soul care. Jesus' words to us are clear. If we are to grow, and if we are to mature and be a blessing to others, we need to abide in Him. We need to root ourselves in His love. For when we do this, Christ's love is made complete in us. We will overflow in joy, which is love's consciousness, in peace, which is love's confidence, in patience, which is love's habit in the world, in kindness, which is love's activity, in generosity, which is love's quantity, in faithfulness, which is love's quality, in gentleness, which is love's tone, and in self-control, which is love's victory. Let this be our prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.